I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now and listen to me carefully, because what I am about to tell you is something I have never shared publicly before, and there is a reason I am sharing it today. 6 months ago, I sat at my own dinner table, in my own home, surrounded by my own family, and a woman looked me dead in the eyes and said, in front of everyone, that I was an embarrassment. Not quietly, not privately, out loud, clearly, deliberately, like she had been saving that moment for a long time and had finally decided tonight was the night. And every single person at that table went silent. My son looked at his plate. My grandchildren stopped chewing. And I sat there, 72 years old, in the chair I have sat in for 30 years, and felt something inside me go very, very still. Not broken, not humiliated, still, the way a person goes still when they have just made a decision so deep and so certain that their body already knows there is no going back. What happened to that woman 6 months later, I did not plan, I did not arrange, and I did not wish for. But when it came, I will be honest with you, I was not surprised, because I have lived long enough to know that how you treat people quietly follows you everywhere you go, until the day it finally catches up. Let me take you back to the beginning, because that dinner table moment did not come out of nowhere, and you need to understand everything that led to it before you can truly appreciate everything that came after. My name is Helen, and I am 72 years old, and I have lived in the same house in North Carolina for 31 years. My late husband Raymond and I bought it the year our son Thomas turned 10, a sturdy brick house with a wide front porch and a dining room big enough for the kind of Sunday dinners I always dreamed of hosting, the kind where every chair is filled and everybody talks over everybody else and the food runs out before the conversation does. Raymond passed 7 years ago, a slow goodbye over 2 years of illness that left me grief-worn but not defeated, because Raymond raised me up to be the kind of woman who keeps standing even when standing is the hardest thing available. Thomas is my only child. He's 42 now, works in engineering, and moved back to North Carolina about 5 years ago after living in Atlanta for most of his 30s. When he came back, he brought with him a woman named Claudia, whom he had been dating for 2 years and whom he married 14 months after their return. I want to be careful here, because I made myself a promise when I started telling this story that I would be honest rather than simply sympathetic to myself. And being honest means telling you that Claudia and I had a complicated relationship from the very beginning, and that some of that complication was not entirely her fault. Claudia came from money. Real money, the kind that has been in a family long enough that nobody remembers exactly where it started, just that it has always been there. Her father owned a regional banking group. Her mother sat on the boards of 3 different charitable foundations. Claudia herself had a graduate degree from Vanderbilt, worked as a consultant for a healthcare firm, and carried herself with a particular kind of confidence that comes not from achievement alone but from never having seriously doubted that achievement was her natural destiny. I am a retired school teacher. I taught 4th grade for 33 years. I drove a sensible car, grew tomatoes in my backyard, made my own curtains because I enjoyed it rather than because I had to, and found genuine happiness in a life that Claudia, I came to understand, quietly considered beneath her. She never said this outright, at least not in the beginning. It came through in smaller ways, the way she would glance around my living room when she first visited, not critically exactly, but assessingly, the way a person looks at something they are trying to decide how to categorize. The way she would sometimes pause before responding to something I said, just a half-second too long, like she was translating my words from a language she found slightly foreign. The way she referred to my neighborhood once to someone on the phone as quaint, a word that carries entirely different weight depending on whose mouth it comes out of. Thomas saw none of this, or perhaps chose not to see it, which I think is more accurate. Thomas had always been a peacekeeper, the kind of man who genuinely believed that if he simply refused to acknowledge tension, the tension would eventually resolve itself out of sheer boredom. It was an approach that worked reasonably well in engineering and very poorly in family relationships, but it was the only tool he had, and so he used it constantly. For the first 2 years of their marriage, I managed things carefully. I invited them to dinner regularly, always cooked well, always kept conversation pleasant, always found something genuine to compliment about Claudia, because I believe strongly that you can always find something real to appreciate about a person if you look with honest eyes. I swallowed the small slights, the assessments, the moments where I felt myself being quietly measured and found lacking, because Thomas was happy, and Thomas's happiness had been the organizing principle of my life since the moment he was born. But here is the thing about swallowing things quietly for too long. Eventually your body runs out of room. The dinner table evening started as a celebration. Thomas had been promoted to a senior director position at his firm, a genuine achievement that deserved celebrating, and I had offered to host the family dinner in his honor. I spent 2 days cooking, the kind of cooking I used to do when Raymond was alive, and we filled that dining room every holiday without effort. Roast chicken, homemade rolls, 3 different side dishes, a chocolate layer cake that had been Thomas's favorite since he was 7 years old. Claudia's parents were there, Gerald and Miriam, visiting from Charleston. Gerald was a quiet man who smiled pleasantly and said little, which I had always appreciated. Miriam was something else entirely, a woman of sharp edges and precise opinions who reminded me of a very expensive piece of cutlery, beautiful and potentially dangerous, and clearly aware of both. Claudia's younger sister Dana was there as well, unmarried, a law student at Duke, who had always been perfectly pleasant to me on the few occasions we had met. My neighbor Ruth had also joined us, my closest friend of 20 years, a retired nurse with a laugh that could fill an entire house and the kind of no-nonsense warmth that I had always found deeply comforting. I had invited Ruth because she and I had been having dinner together on Thomas's birthdays and special occasions since Raymond died, and because honestly, having Ruth in the room always made me feel steadier, more myself. We were midway through the meal, conversation flowing reasonably well, when Miriam began asking Claudia about their plans for the upcoming holidays. Claudia mentioned they were considering splitting the holidays between North Carolina and Charleston this year, and Miriam made a small sound of approval and then turned to me and said, "I imagine that will be a change for you, Helen. You must be used to having them here every year." It was a reasonable enough comment, and I answered reasonably, saying yes, I loved having them for the holidays, that the house felt properly alive when Thomas was home. And then Claudia said, lightly, conversationally, as though it were barely worth mentioning, "Mom, we should tell her about the Charleston house before the holidays. That way she has time to adjust her expectations." The Charleston house. I had no idea what she was referring to, and my expression must have shown it, because Claudia looked at me with that half-second pause I had come to know so well, and said, "Oh, Thomas hasn't told you yet. We're buying a second property in Charleston, near my parents. We'll probably spend most of our time there once we can work remotely full-time. This area is lovely for now, but long-term, it makes more sense to be somewhere with more opportunity." Somewhere with more opportunity. She said it gently, pleasantly even, but we were all adults in that room and we all heard what she meant. This area, my area, the neighborhood I had lived in for 31 years, the community where I had taught hundreds of children, was not enough. Not sophisticated enough, not wealthy enough, not the right backdrop for the life Claudia intended to build. I looked at Thomas. He was looking at his plate. I said, as evenly as I could manage, "That sounds like an exciting plan. I hope you'll still visit often." And that should have been the end of it. That should have been a small, painful moment that passed like all the other small, painful moments had passed, swallowed down, filed away, never mentioned again. But then Miriam, Claudia's mother, set down her fork, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as deliberately kind in the way that is actually deliberately cruel, and said, "Helen, I think what Claudia is trying to say is that as Thomas's career grows, their lives will naturally expand beyond what this environment can offer. It's not a reflection on you personally. Some people are simply built for bigger stages, and it's a mother's job to recognize when her child has outgrown the nest, even when it's hard to let go." The table went completely silent. Ruth, beside me, put down her own fork very slowly. I felt every single person in that room hold their breath, waiting to see what I would do with what had just been said to me, in my own home, at my own table, by a woman whose food I had cooked and whose wine I had poured and whose daughter had just announced she was taking my son away from me to a city where she had always wanted to be, as though my existence in his life were a phase he was finally ready to move past. And here is what I did. I picked up my water glass, took a small sip, set it back down, and said, very quietly, "More chicken, Gerald." Gerald, bless that quiet man, said yes immediately and held out his plate with visible relief. The dinner ended. People went home. Ruth stayed to help me clean up, and when the last car pulled out of the driveway, she looked at me across the kitchen counter and said simply, "Ellen." I shook my head. "Not tonight, Ruth." She nodded and we finished the dishes in silence, because Ruth has known me long enough to understand that some things need to be carried alone for a little while before they can be put down properly. Thomas called me the next morning, apologetic in the vague, circular way of a man who knows something went wrong but cannot bring himself to define it precisely. "Mom, I know last night was a lot. Miriam can be a lot. I hope you know none of that was meant to hurt you." I asked him the question I actually needed answered. "Thomas, did you know about the Charleston house before last night?" "Boss, we've been talking about it for a while, yeah." "And you didn't tell me?" Another pause. I didn't want to make it into a big thing. I told him I understood, said goodbye, and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where all of it had happened the night before, and I thought about what Ruth had said when she was leaving, the one thing she did say before she respected my request for silence. She had paused at the front door, coat on, and said, "You know, Helen, I've been a nurse for 35 years, and I've noticed something consistent. The people who make the most noise about being on a bigger stage than everyone else, they are almost always one unexpected moment away from needing exactly the kind of simple, decent people they spent all that time looking down on." I thought about those words for a long time after she left, and then I did something I had not done in years. I pulled out the journal I used to keep when Raymond was sick, the one I wrote in every night to keep my thoughts from crowding me out of my own sleep, and I started writing again, everything, every small slight, every assessed glance, every moment I had quietly absorbed over 2 years of trying to make room for a woman who had never once tried to make room for me. I did not know why I was writing it down. I only knew it felt necessary, the way things sometimes feel necessary before you understand their purpose. Now here is where this story takes its first real turn, the one I did not see coming at all. About 3 weeks after that dinner, Ruth called me on a Tuesday morning, voice carrying something careful in it that immediately made me sit down before she even started talking. "Helen, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it any other way." She told me that her daughter, who worked a medical practice in town, had mentioned something to Ruth the previous evening, carefully and without identifying details, but enough that Ruth understood the significance immediately. Claudia had come into the practice 2 weeks earlier, not as a patient but accompanying someone else, and the someone else, Ruth's daughter had said, was not Thomas. I sat with that information for a very long moment before asking, "Are you certain?" My daughter has no reason to say it if she wasn't, Ruth said quietly. I'm sorry, honey. This was the first twist, landing like something heavy dropped from a height. Claudia, who had spent 2 years making me feel small, who had allowed her mother to humiliate me in my own home, who had spoken about moving my son 3 states away as though I were simply a logistical consideration to be managed, was apparently conducting some portion of her life that Thomas knew nothing about. I told Ruth I needed time to think. She told me she understood completely. I want to be honest about what I did with this information, because I think my choice says something important about who I am and who I was trying to remain through all of this. I did not call Thomas. I did not confront Claudia. I did not do anything at all with what Ruth had told me, not immediately, not because I didn't feel the urge to, but because I was deeply uncertain about my own motivations. I was a hurt mother, a humiliated woman, someone who had been publicly diminished at her own table, and I could not fully trust that anything I did with this information came from a place of genuine concern for my son rather than from my own wounded pride. So I did nothing, and I waited, because sometimes doing nothing is the bravest and most honest choice available. The second twist came about 6 weeks later, and this one came from an entirely unexpected direction. Dana, Claudia's younger sister, a law student from Duke, called me out of nowhere on a Saturday afternoon. We had spoken perhaps 5 times in total in the years since Thomas and Claudia married, always briefly, always pleasantly, never with any real depth. So when her name appeared on my phone screen on a random Saturday, I answered with genuine curiosity. She was calling, she said, because she had something to tell me that she had been sitting on for several weeks, something she felt I deserved to know, and something she felt deeply conflicted about given that it involved her own sister. Dana told me that 3 months before that dinner, Claudia had come to her privately and told her she was planning to eventually end her marriage to Thomas. Not because of another person, Dana said, at least not primarily, but because Claudia had come to feel that she had made a mistake, that she had married Thomas during a transitional period in her own life when she wasn't thinking clearly about long-term compatibility, and that she had stayed this long partly out of habit and partly because the timing of a divorce had never felt convenient. The Charleston house plan, Dana told me, was not actually about remote work or opportunity at all. It was Claudia's way of gradually separating Thomas from his life in North Carolina so that when she eventually ended things, the disruption to his professional and social network would be somewhat pre-managed, making the transition cleaner. She had essentially been engineering the slow relocation of my son's entire life in preparation for leaving him. And the dinner, Dana said, voice heavy with something that sounded like genuine shame, the dinner where her mother had said what she said to me, that had not been accidental either. Miriam knew about Claudia's plans. She had known for months. The dinner table comments had been, Dana believed, Miriam's way of pre-establishing a narrative, of subtly framing me as the difficult, clinging mother whose smallness had always held Thomas back, so that when the divorce eventually happened, there would already be a story in place about why Thomas's life in North Carolina had never been right for him. I had been humiliated strategically, at my own table, by people who had already decided what was going to happen to my son and were simply managing the storyline around it. I asked Dana why she was telling me this. She was quiet for a moment, then said, because what my mother said to you that night was wrong, Mrs. Felton. You opened your home to us, you fed us, and we sat at your table and treated you like you were an obstacle. I've been raised to believe that's acceptable behavior toward people my family considers beneath us, and I'm a law student now and I think about justice a lot, and I can't make peace with what happened. You deserve better. Thomas deserves to know the truth. And Claudia needs to stop letting our mother script her life like she's a character in someone else's story. This was the most unexpected twist of all, not because of what Dana revealed but because of where it came from. The youngest person in that room, the one I had barely noticed, turning out to be the only one with enough honesty to come back and make something right. I thanked Dana sincerely. I told her that what she had done took real courage, and I meant that completely. And then I made a decision about what to do next that surprised even me. I called Thomas and asked him to come for dinner. Just him, I said, nobody else. I cooked simply, the way I used to cook when it was just the two of us after Raymond died. Roast potatoes and green beans and the plain roast chicken that Thomas had always said tasted like every good thing about childhood. We sat at that table, the same table, and I told him everything. Ruth's information, Dana's call, all of it, as honestly and as carefully as I could, without editorializing, without pressing my own feelings into the facts. He sat very still for a long time when I finished. Thomas has always processed things quietly, turning them over internally before he lets them out, and I gave him all the silence he needed. Finally he said, "How long have you known?" I told him the timeline honestly. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner. I said, because I needed to be sure I was telling you for your sake and not for mine, and because some part of me hoped I was wrong and you'd never need to know. Thomas put his face in his hands for a long moment, then looked up and said something that cracked me open in the best possible way. "Mom, I'm sorry about the dinner. I'm sorry I let that happen and said nothing. That's been sitting with me for months. You didn't deserve that." "No," I said gently, "I didn't. But neither do you deserve what's been planned for you without your knowledge." What happened between Thomas and Claudia after that evening is their story to tell, not mine, and I will respect that boundary. What I can tell you is that Thomas had several very direct conversations with Claudia over the following weeks, conversations that Claudia apparently found confronting in ways she had not anticipated, and that by the time 6 months had passed since that dinner table evening, Thomas and Claudia were separated. The Charleston house purchase had been quietly abandoned, and Thomas had moved into a rental apartment 12 minutes from my front door. And Claudia, the woman who had looked around my living room like she was categorizing something beneath her, who had allowed her mother to tell me I was a woman whose child had outgrown her at my own dinner table, was managing something none of us had known was coming. It turned out the healthcare consulting firm Claudia worked for had been under regulatory investigation for several months before any of this happened, an investigation into billing practices that several senior consultants, including Claudia, had been centrally involved in. The details became public about 5 months after that dinner, reported in regional business news, and Claudia's name appeared in the documentation not as a witness but as someone whose professional conduct was under direct review. The investigation was ongoing when I last heard anything about it, and I want to be very clear that I take no pleasure in professional or legal difficulties for any human being, including Claudia, because that is simply not who I am. But I thought about what Ruth had said standing at my front door that night, about the people who make the most noise about bigger stages being one unexpected moment away from needing exactly the kind of simple, decent people they spent so long looking down on. The week the news about the investigation became public, Thomas mentioned to me that Claudia had called him, not about the separation negotiations but about something personal, something about navigating a difficult professional period and not knowing who to trust. Thomas, who is his father's son in all the ways that matter most, had listened without judgment and suggested she find good legal counsel and lean on the people who genuinely cared about her well-being. "Who did you mean," I asked him, "when you said the people who genuinely care about her?" Thomas looked at me thoughtfully and said, honestly, "Mom, I think I meant Dana." I smiled at that, because Dana, the youngest and quietest person at that dinner table, the one nobody had really noticed, It turned out to be the one person in that whole situation who had chosen honesty over loyalty to a comfortable lie. And I thought that Claudia, whatever she was facing now, was fortunate to have at least one person in her corner whose decency was real rather than performed. It has been 7 months now since that dinner. Thomas comes over on Sundays. We have roast chicken and green beans, and he tells me about his week and asks about mine, the way we did when he first moved back to North Carolina, before everything got complicated. My dining room table has 7 chairs, and most Sundays only 2 of them are filled. But I have learned, finally, at 72, that a full table is not always a happy one, and a quiet table shared with someone who truly sees you is worth more than all the noise in the world. Ruth still comes over on Thomas's birthdays. She brought flowers this past Sunday for no reason except that they were pretty and she thought of me when she saw them, which is the kind of friendship that sustains a life more reliably than any amount of wealth or status or carefully managed appearances ever could. And Miriam, the woman who told me at my own table that my child had outgrown me, sent me something I did not expect about 3 months ago, a short handwritten note that said, "Helen, I owe you an apology for what I said at your dinner. I said it deliberately and that was wrong. I hope Thomas knows how fortunate he is to have a mother whose table is always open. Miriam." I read that note 3 times. Then I put it in the journal I had started keeping again after that dinner, the one where I wrote down everything I had absorbed quietly over 2 years of trying to make room for people who were not making room for me. I put it at the very back, behind all of it, as a reminder of something I want to carry with me for whatever years I have left. Dignity is not something anyone can take from you at a dinner table. They can try. But if you stay quiet, stay decent, and stay absolutely certain of your own worth, it comes back to you eventually, sometimes in the most unexpected envelopes, from the most unexpected people. I'm 72 years old. My table is always open, and I have finally learned, after a long time of being too generous with people who mistook my kindness for weakness, that the most powerful thing a woman can do when someone humiliates her in her own home is absolutely nothing, at least until the moment is exactly right. That moment always comes. You just have to be patient enough to let it